Hi, thank you all for coming. Sorry for the delay. My name is Lauren Fordyce. I am from the Office of Behavioral and Social Science Research. I am a AAAS Science Technology Policy Fellow, and I wanted to welcome you to our monthly Behavioral and Social Science Research lecture series here at the NIH. Today we have Dr. Joan Chow from Northwestern University, who is going to give us a talk entitled Cultural Neuroscience, Closing the Gap in Global Mental Health Disparities. She is the director of the International Cultural Neuroscience Consortium. She received her BS in Symbolic Systems from Stanford University and a PhD in psychology from Harvard University. Her research expertise is in social, affective, and cultural neuroscience. And over the past 10 years, she has examined how culture, race, and social status affect the human mind, brain, and behavior. And I'm not going to spend too much time introducing her because I'd rather let her work speak for herself. So if you will help me welcome Dr. Joan Chow.
Thank you very much, Lauren, for the kind introduction. And it's an honor to be back at NIH for the BSSR lecture series. It sounds like this has been going really well, as usual, all year. And I'm thrilled to be here to talk to you today about some of the progress within cultural neuroscience and population health disparities research. And in particular, I'm going to be talking today about the research in theory in cultural neuroscience and its role in closing the gap in population health disparities. So we know that mental health disorders make up the majority of disease around the world and pose a significant global financial burden, both in treatment costs annually. The Joint Center for Political and Economic Studies estimates that eliminating racial and ethnic disparities will lead to a reduction in indirect costs, particularly within the United States, associated with illness and premature death by more than $1 trillion between 2003 and 2006 alone, so within 3 years, a significant financial cost eliminated. A key challenge facing global mental health is to understand the factors that affecting etiology and treatment of mental health disorders, as well as the mechanisms underlying disparities along a range of common mental health disorders. So we can see here that the prevalence of mental health disorders spans across the globe. And according to surveys as early as 2004, the United States has the highest rate of mental illness. So if we look both within Western and non-Western contexts, we see mental health disorders as a key priority nationally. When we look within the United States from as early as the beginning of the decade, of the century, we see that the prevalence of lifetime and past year disorders as a function of race and ethnicity varies as well. So within the multicultural nation of the United States, we know that culture, race, ethnicity affects the prevalence of mental health disorders. Now, this population variation in mental health provides an important natural window into the questions that can be addressed with cultural neuroscience. And in particular, cultural neuroscience as a research approach can address closing the gap, in particular, of disparities across racial and ethnic groups, and understanding, one, the basic mechanisms of disorders, as well as the factors, the sociocultural factors affecting the access to treatment. Now, why this interest in basic mechanisms? One thing we know about human behavior and human experience is there's this very important phenomenology, this classic mind-body problem of phenomenology. What is it like to know? So in philosophy, Jackson in 1986 proposes this question, even if we have a third-person understanding of all the knowledge in the world, of what it's like to see a color, for instance, red, how is it that people experience red? Is there something lost without having the first-person perspective? And indeed, materialists will argue that absolutely there's something important about phenomenology, about first-person perspective that provides an important knowledge into what it means to be human and what it is to have a quality life. Now, within psychology, the science of the mind, the science of behavior, we see there has been a really long-standing interest, particularly within the United States, in understanding, this connection between the mind, brain, and behavior. And we can see that within the field of psychology, the nation has taken a very strong investment in this important priority. So much so that, in fact, at this time, 96% of psychological samples come from countries with only 12% of the world's population. So how is it that we've actually grown in research knowledge within this discipline, and how is it affecting us on a global scale? If we look, by contrast, at the natural sciences, we see that, in fact, we have this very interesting reversal where, 70% of, for instance, natural science research is being conducted within the global context, so non-Western contexts. So this is a very interesting problem, what anthropologists and psychologists have termed the weird problem, because, in fact, is there something about being Western, educated, industrialized, rich, democratic, that affects, in fact, our scientific understanding of the human mind, brain, and behavior? In 2003, Xu-Chen Li, a lifespan psychologist from the Max Planck Institute, proposed this culture biology interaction model, and in fact proposed 3 timescales with which we can look at this: phylogenetically, ontogenetically, and even within microgenesis, within the situation. So across these 3 timescales, we can see the interactive processes of both cultural and biological processes. For instance, looking at culture-gene interactions, culture and social context interactions, and even culture within the immediate environment. So how is it that culture is affecting and mediating different types of individual contexts? These different types of interactions across multiple timescales provides a very important lifespan framework for which to understand how it is we arise at healthy aging populations and a complete understanding of human behavior. Cultural neuroscience in the past 2 decades has sought to understand, in particular, the origins of human diversity. So how is it that we understand aging and growing as a function of cultural and neuroscientific processes? And in the course of approximately 10 to 15 years, we see that there has been a growth of interdisciplinary research amongst neuroscientists, psychologists, cultural scientists, eager to understand how is it that the culture and neuroscience shape each other mutually. And across the literature, we find that understanding the human diversity requires a comprehensive integration of the cultural and brain sciences. So if we take a look at this from a pathways perspective, we see that on the one hand, we have this important question regarding environmental health. How does the environment affect health and human behavior? And we can think about this historically as well as contemporarily as a set of environmental or ecological factors that in fact affect or influence behavior. From this, we want to understand it both at the broad scale of environment as well as within the micro scale of the gene. So how is it that the gene and the genome, genomic and genetic pathways shape behavior? We've spent a lot of investment, financial as well as infrastructural investment in identifying specific molecular and genetic mechanisms underlying human behavior and to interesting effects. So we know that, for instance, the gene is regulating very different multiple aspects of human behavior through neural pathways. So for instance, looking and identifying at what kinds of neural pathways are regulated by what kind of specific genetic mechanisms plays a very important role in understanding this connection between environmental health and human health. And we've seen within, for instance, neurogenetics or imaging genetics that the identification of specific genes and how it influences particular neural pathways is in itself a very important and exciting breakthrough in neuroscience. From a cultural science perspective, a lot of emphasis has been placed on identifying the factors associated with the interaction of environment and culture. How does environment shape culture? How does culture shape the environment? And we've seen that the identification of specific environmental and cultural factors, the way that they interact, has produced a lot of very important insights into explaining human behavior. At the same time, this how is it that we study culture and its influence on behavior, requiring standardized paradigms, the identification of methods, as well as theories that can address the wide range, the wide diversity of human behavior that we see geographically across the world. cultural neuroscience in particular has been identifying pathways across two specific different types of interactions. One is cultural and genetics, so looking at that culture gene pathway across multiple timescales, as well as the influence of culture on the person, or culture influencing the neural mechanisms of the mind. So how is it that these different broad cultural factors shape specific neural pathways and predict human behavior? And when we look at this integrated perspective of human behavior, we can see that by identifying the specific factors within environmental health that shape human behavior as a function of these interactions between the environment, culture, and genes, through the person, through their mind and brain, we begin to develop much more specific and detailed models of human behavior. So from a computational perspective, we can also assess, how is it that these different factors are predicting human behavior? What kinds of factors are independently and also interactively shaping the way that we interact with each other? One standard example within cultural neuroscience has been understanding what specific factors predict social interaction. So this is a huge effort in explaining, the very complex world of humans. And the identification of specific cultural and neural pathways has been the key challenge in understanding social interaction, particularly amongst humans. And the identification of the cultural system of individualism and collectivism, or independence interdependence, has been a major key fundamental principle within cultural science that has allowed us to make accurate and sustained predictions about social interaction. And within cultural neuroscience, we've also been looking at what are the different pathways shaping culture and social interaction within the person. So how is it that the brain is predicting social interaction? What are the neural pathways? And in particular, a key region of interest is the medial prefrontal cortex. So we've learned a little bit about the prefrontal cortex, mostly from our understanding of it within the social and emotional domain. So, for instance, how is it that this prefrontal cortex is regulating a complex social interaction? So, historically, and also across generations, we see that individualism and collectivism as a cultural system has a very sustained influence on human behavior. So if we look philosophically back at the cultural traditions of West and East, we can see that in the writings of Socrates and Lao Tzu, for instance, this emphasis of the self, or the self within context, plays a really important role in understanding how it is that social organization occurs within human culture. And contemporarily, we see individualism and collectivism as conceptualized as an interaction between self and others. So how is it that within individualistic context, the self is defined as autonomous and agentic within others, a community of others? Collectivism as a community defined by the connection or the integration, the interaction of self with others. Now, how is it that we develop standard paradigms with which to understand social interaction and the cultural influences on social interaction? So in a very elegant paradigm developed by cultural and social psychologists approximately 20 to 30 years ago, they came up with this very interesting idea called the self-test. So how is it that we even know we have a self? And one of the interesting insights is via language, humans have a conception and understanding of the self. They have a conceptual mind. And this mind, to what extent is it shaped by culture? Well, to what extent is it autonomous and agentic from community? Or how much is it connected and contextual with community? So in this standard paradigm, we see that, we can look at presenting humans with different types of self-descriptions, general self-descriptions, contextual self-descriptions, and compare them to just cognitive judgments. So, is this statement written in a certain font or not? And look to see it, to what extent is culture shaping that conceptual or cognitive representation of the self? And when we measure this, both with behavioral surveys as well as with neuroscience measures, so for instance, with functional neuroimaging, a non-invasive measurement of the brain, we can see the identification of a subregion of the prefrontal cortex, in particular the medial prefrontal cortex. And within this brain region, which is located medially in between the right and the left hemispheres, we look at the percent signal change within this region. So to what extent is this region showing cerebral variability as a function of cognitive processes? And when you look at individualists, people who identify with this individualistic or independent context, we see that the percent signal change is, or the activity, the indirect neural activity within this brain region is increased for general self-descriptions relative to contextual self-descriptions. By contrast, collectivists, or people who define as interdependent, you see this neural activity within this same brain region as increased for contextual relative to general self-statements. And then no difference for looking at simple linguistic judgments. So if we're just comparing font. This suggests that within this brain, we have a sensitivity to cultural values. So when we identify as an individualist or a collectivist, we can see that this particular region, the medial prefrontal cortex, shows this variability neurally in response to specific types of self-descriptions. Now, as much as we can think of culture as categorical, so are we an individualist or collectivist, are we an independent or interdependent, it's important to note it's also continuous. It's a spectrum of ways of thinking about the self and connected to others. So even as we look cross-nationally, both within the US as well as within Japan, we can see that the individual description or the individual self-report of cultural values predicts activity within this region in response to self-judgments. So this suggests that both biologically as well as culturally, both within the brain as well as within behavior, we can measure the influence of culture on the social brain. So here we've identified in both in independent samples as well as across independent labs that the medial prefrontal cortex plays a very important role in how culture influences social interaction. Now, how do we explain this cultural variability at the neural level? How do we explain cultural differences in biology? And it's somewhat heartwarming to invoke this idea of coevolution, or culture gene coevolutionary theory. And this idea is just that as we've evolved as a species, the Homo sapiens species, how is it that we've gone from being one species to a culturally diverse species? And culture gene coevolutionary theory provides very important insights into ways in which we can predict diversity, both in mind, brain, as well as in behavior. So culture gene coevolutionary theory, or dual inheritance theory, suggests that there are really at least two inheritance routes to explaining human behavior. One is a cultural route. So, for instance, looking at cultural niche construction, how is it that the niche of the organism is created as a function of cultural practice? And in particular, how is it that the organism or the population is influencing the environment? How can the population improve human health or via the environment? A second pathway is looking at the biological pathway, the neural pathway, for instance, although it can vary across different levels of mechanism. So this is inferring more the idea that ecology and the environment in itself presents a series of different types of factors that can affect the behavior of a population. So how is it that these different environmental factors affect the population of organisms? So we have both a cultural pathway as well as a genetic pathway. Now, one classic example of culture gene coevolutionary theory is cattle milk genes and human lactose tolerance genes. So as we see that within Europe, for instance, there is an increased prevalence of cattle that can produce milk digestible to humans, we also see that there's an increased prevalence of humans that have genes that can tolerate such lactose or cross-species consumption. So this suggests that, in fact, there's this coevolution cross-species between a cultural practice, lactose tolerance, and a genetic mechanism, milk genes. We see also that, importantly, as this prevalence increases or changes as a fluctuation of cultural practice as well as biological mechanism, in fact, we see this as a geographic phenomenon. So, for instance, centralized within Northern Europe, this prevalence increase coincidentally. If we have a genetic and cultural inheritance interaction within a particular geographic region, how is it that we can explain how environmental health and cultural factors are predicting human behavior, such as, for instance, consumption of food? Evolutionary origins of cultural theory suggests that, in fact, there are a number of different environmental health factors that can affect the origins or emergence of culture. So, for instance, infectious disease or pathogen prevalence has been identified as a key factor in affecting the origin or the emergence of culture. So if we look, for instance, the presence of pathogenic microbiological agents, contagious disease, the causes of contagious disease, or the way in which it's transmitted. So, for instance, the cultural or biological transmission of different types of disease, we can see that, in fact, culture also produces a defense. So culture as a defense to reduce or eliminate disease. Now, when we look at infectious disease geographically, we can see that it still varies quite considerably cross-nationally. So while the West and particularly industrialized nations have been very effective in reducing this particular environmental health condition, we see also that there are other regions with which reduction is still occurring. This suggests to us that the cultural variability cross-nationally may occur or emerge or maintain due to the presence of chronic or infectious diseases. Now, similarly, we see that this cultural variability, so looking at individualism and collectivism or independence and interdependence, varies geographically. And one question we can ask is, why is there such a variability in cultural systems, and how is it both sustaining and maintaining? So again, looking at it as a spectrum. And Fincher and colleagues in 2008 made a very interesting and important insight, which is that this historic infectious disease prevalence is concording with individualism and collectivism. And each of these data points represents a nation. So across nationally, if we look epidemiologically at the prevalence of culture and of disease, we have a very interesting data theory in order to understand this pathogen defense model. So what are the ways in which culture responds to this type of insight? You can see that when culture is utilized and incorporated in different ways of protecting humans from disease or protecting the species from disease, there are a number of different types of practices that can be incorporated. So, for instance, the utilization of artifacts or face masks, for instance, technology, looking at thermal scanners. Those are all different ways in which we can see as culture and technology responding to this environmental factor that's affecting human health. So we have some evidence for culture gene coevolutionary theory of individualism and collectivism. So the idea of this is that pathogen prevalence has led to the cultural selection of individualism collectivism. This cultural variability serves an adaptive function. Once adaptive, cultural selection of different value systems leads to then a genetic mechanism or genetic pathway in order to reinforce a particular cultural path. So, for instance, we can see as culture and genetic selection further shaping cognitive and neural architecture. Now, what kind of mechanism might facilitate the emergence and the maintenance of culture? One such gene that has been investigated or of interest is the serotonin transporter gene. This gene has been identified as important in social and emotional human behavior. It has been identified as important cross species, as important in the regulation of the social and emotional brain. So when we look at the serotonin transporter gene as a putative genetic mechanism for culture, how is it that culture and genes are interacting to predict different types of human social interaction? And in particular, we know that within the serotonin transporter gene, these two variants, the short variant and the long variant, can regulate the efficiency of serotonin reuptake. So if it is the case that there's this variability in the reuptake efficiency, might it be that the variability or the spectrum of efficiency in that reuptake is in fact related to this variability we see culturally in behavior? And some of the important insights early on, looking at the interactions between genes and environment, looking at the interactions between the individual and community, have identified this particular gene as very important genetically in predicting disease prevalence. So if we look, for instance, at a mental health disorder like major depression, you can see that for individuals within a given community, carrying that short allele in the onset or in the presence of multiple life stresses can lead to an increase of disease prevalence relative to within a given community carries of the L allele or the L genotype. So now that we've identified a genetic mechanism that shows an interaction with environmental factors to predict disease prevalence, what is the role of culture in interacting with this model to predict health promotion and disease prevention? So one way to look at this from a mechanistic perspective is to identify the complete pathway. So what is the complete pathway between culture, from culture and genes interacting with the environment to human behavior? And Ahmad Hariri, Danny Weinberger, and colleagues in 2002 discovered very influentially that the human amygdala, in fact, shows this variability as a function of gene. So we see that there's this variability in neural activity within the human amygdala as a function of carrying the short as relative to the long allele. So we see this replicated across cohorts and across studies now, and some work internationally suggesting that there is this continuous relation between this particular gene and the activity within this brain region. We've also seen that, for instance, Canley and Lesh proposed that this interaction between this particular gene or family of genes and interaction with life stress can, in fact, predict activity across regions of interest. So, for instance, if we look at the neural circuitry of imitation and bonding, social bonding, for instance, how is it that these neural mechanisms of culture are, in fact, regulated by this gene-environment interaction? So Kate Blazinski and I have been very interested in looking at this relation between culture-gene coevolutionary theory and this interaction between the serotonin transporter gene and the cultural system of individualism and collectivism. So, for instance, we looked cross-nationally at the relation between the serotonin transporter gene and the cultural system of individualism and collectivism. We were surprised to discover that there was, in fact, an interesting relation between this cultural system and a genetic system. So in particular, if we look cross-nationally, we see that there is an association or relation between cultural collectivism and the prevalence of the short allele. Now, even if there's an association between culture and genes, is it predictive of an epidemiological phenomenon such as the prevalence of disease cross-nationally? So then we looked at epidemiological prevalence of anxiety and mood disorders, for instance, and this is the data from the World Health Organization, and we found a very surprising discovery, which is that, in fact, there is this inverse relation. So if we look at what predicts the prevalence of anxiety or mood disorders, we see that there is actually, surprisingly, an interesting directional trend where, in fact, cultural collectivism, the increase of cultural collectivism leads to decrease in disease prevalence, particularly mental health disease prevalence, both for these two diseases, anxiety and mood disorders. Similarly, the prevalence of the short allele, in particular cross-nationally, within the international community, actually predicts also reduction of disease prevalence. So this was surprising to us because it showed that within a community, we get a reverse relationship as relative to comparing across the globe. And we theorize that, in fact, this gene pathway from gene to disease is mediated by culture. So the extent to which a culture is collectivistic or individualist will be reflective of the influence of this gene-disease pathway. So cultural collectivism, in fact, emerged in maintaining to reduce the disease prevalence cross-nationally and possibly also from a health promotion perspective, promoting specific types of health behaviors. Furthermore, we sought to seek evidence cross-nationally of whether or not this disease model or the infectious disease model of culture, in fact, was an appropriate network point model for understanding the emergence of culture. So, in fact, we did find that this emergence or this sustained gene expression association with culture, in fact, could be because of this prevalence of infectious disease. So, in summary, pathogen prevalence leading to this cultural selection of individualism and collectivism, then culture serving this adaptive function. Once adaptive, the cultural selection of individualism and collectivism leading to the selection of a particular gene pathway. Then this culture and genetic selection then further shaping cognitive and neural architecture. So, once these pathways are co-occurring, how is it that they shape the mind and the brain, as well as behavior? Now, if we look at this integrated model of human behavior, we see that we begin to identify the factors as predicting complex social interaction. So, in fact, pathogen prevalence or chronic disease prevalence as predicting this culture gene pathway and the influence that it has on particular neural activity within the medial prefrontal cortex as shaping social interaction and complex social behavior. So this is just one example of how culture gene coevolutionary theory can in fact predict social interaction and the identification of the specific factors as predictive of social behavior. Now, what about other types of cultural and genetic systems, or even different types of environmental factors? How might that affect behavior? And in fact, Michelle Gelfand and colleagues have identified a specific cultural system, tightness and looseness, as being predictive of moral decision making. So when we think about the justifiability of moral action, for instance, or a given behavior, how is it that a particular environmental health factor can in fact predict moral decision making? So if we look at Gelfand's exciting and novel work on tightness-looseness, she shows that there's geographic variability in the extent to which people adhere to social norms or their responses to violation of social norms. So even when culture has set up a system of social norms, when people violate those social norms, to what extent are there different moral judgments associated with that? And Alyssa Mrazek has begun to identify culture gene coevolution of tightness-looseness as a model and the serotonin transporter gene. And what she finds is that there is this very interesting relation between different types of environmental factors and the emergence of tightness-looseness as a cultural system and its relation to the serotonin transporter gene. So if we look not only at disease prevalence, but we look at a number of other different types of factors that affect environmental health. So for instance, the way that humans interact and the level of risk or uncertainty within a given environment, and you add the totality of those factors that affect risk and uncertainty within environmental health, we see that there is a predictive relation between tightness-looseness and this particular frequency of the gene. Additionally, we see that this relation or system of culture and genetic pathway in fact predicts the justifiability of moral behavior. So if we look at survey data across nationally, you can see that culture and genetic pathways in fact predict this justifiability of moral behavior. So if in fact genes are predicting moral behavior as a function of a cultural system such as tightness and looseness, how is it that we can explain this as a function of interactions with environmental health? So one possibility, in fact, is that by identifying the different weightings of factors that reduce a risk or uncertainty within the environment, we can, in fact, affect or predict moral decision-making and possibly change or alter individual and collective or cultural tightness-looseness norms as a function of both cultural and biological pathways. So we see that even when we're understanding or identifying specific culture gene models of human behavior, in fact, the specific cultural system we're looking at or the specific environmental factors we're looking at have a very important role to play in the specific types of behaviors that are varying within and across communities. Now, one particular set of human behaviors and psychological neural mechanisms that we've been interested in is in empathy. So given the cultural variability that we see both at the macro and the micro scale, how is it that we in fact can have coherent, cohesive, and cooperative social interaction, even when amongst a variety of environmental factors that influence risk and uncertainty? Vonnie Mather and Takiko Harada at Texas A&M and National Institute of Physiological Sciences have been very interested in understanding, at least within one community, within a multicultural community, how is it that identities such as race can influence empathic neural responses to emotional scenes. So within the past 10 to 15 years, there's been a number of very interesting, important advances within identifying specific empathic neural mechanisms within the brain. So looking at both the ways that people empathize affectively or emotionally, as well as the ways that people empathize cognitively or via understandings of self and other. So if we look at affective sharing, so the ways in which people experience the human experience of pain, both in self and others, we see that there's this pain matrix of the anterior cingulate cortex and bilateral anterior insula that reliably and robustly activates in response to perceptions and experience of pain. If we look at cognitive empathy, so how is it that people can understand the pain of the other, even in the absence of a direct perception? So if we look at the way that people imagine, for instance, the pain of the self or others, we see that this region, the prefrontal cortex, shows increased neural activity in response to this imagined self or other pain. So if we look at perspective taking as, for instance, a cognitive route to empathy, we see that there are really at least two systems for human empathy. Now, in a sample of African American and Caucasian Americans within the United States, we looked at the role of race and racial identity in affecting human empathy within the brain. And Vonnie identified, in particular, this is a very important paradigm looking at environmental health as a key factor in the way that human empathic responses are shaped. So, for instance, if we look at pain experienced within the environment in response to an environmental factor, such as a natural disaster, how is it that people of different races or different ethnicities respond to that? And we can see that, in fact, you can measure this in a number of different ways, right? So you can look at altruistic motivation, you can look at interpersonal responses, you can look at hierarchy preferences or implicit processes, both conscious and unconscious processes. And what she finds is that there's this very robust empathic response affectively to pain expressed in the environment. So when we have this response to an environmental event, such as a natural disaster, we see this very robust response within the pain matrix, and that people's self-reported empathy, how they actually feel for the other, is correlated, very nicely predicted with this brain mechanism. We also see that race plays an important role. So if we look within the minority group of African Americans relative to Caucasian Americans, there's this increased self-reporting responsive empathy for minorities within their community. And we see that it's predictive of activity within the medial prefrontal cortex in response to a number of different types of questions or different types of ways of helping. So, for instance, if we look at altruistic motivation, how much empathy do you feel? How much time would you give? How much money would you give? This is all correlated nicely with the activity within medial prefrontal cortex. Now, an important factor affecting this altruistic motivation and activity within the region for minorities as well as majority members is ethnic identification. So when people are really responding ethnically, they identify with their group. How is it affecting their empathic neural response? And we see that African Americans have this heightened empathic response within the cortical midline structures, medial prefrontal cortex, mid-cingulate cortex, and posterior cingulate, relative to Caucasian Americans. And Caucasian Americans is a majority group. you see this very robust activity within the parahippocampal gyrus in response to the pain perceived in the environment. So suggesting that there are different neural pathways for racially identified and majority group members in responding to a natural disaster. And we see it's also predictive. So if you look across the group, irrespective of racial identity, but within the nation, for instance, that the degree of racial identification as a function of the individual predicts activity within these regions. So how is it and why is it that we have these different neural pathways, and how can that predict aid and recovery? So if we look across groups within a cultural context, we can see that empathic neural response for emotional pain of humankind can differ within the empathic neural pathway, and that you see this strong affective response that is automatic, as well as a cognitive response that is as a function of how much people identify with a particular group. Now, Bobby Chion at Nanyang Technological University has been looking at the role of culture in particular. So if we start to look across cultural communities, how is it that culture affects our empathy for others? And in particular, he's identified a cultural system of hierarchy preference as being predictive of empathic neural response. Because so we know that cultures will vary in preference for hierarchy, and in fact, cultural hierarchical relations may in fact be very adaptive for maintaining social harmony. So if we look at the role of hierarchy in maintaining social harmony, how is it that this varies as a function of geography? And then how does it affect the interaction of the person with the environment? And we see here that if we look cross-culturally, looking at Native Koreans and Caucasian Americans, in response to pain experienced in the environment relative to no pain, there are a number of different cultural moderators of empathy. So for instance, we could look at hierarchy preference or the individual's actual empathy, the cultural factors, the cultural variability, the degree to which people identify with their minority group, display rules, so to what extent are the social norms variable, and explicit attitudes, so how does expression of an attitude, for instance, affect this cultural variability. And Bobby found that really hierarchy preference as a cultural system appears to play a very important role in empathy bias. So for instance, we see that Koreans and Korean culture highly valuing this hierarchy preference. We see also that there's this very strong empathy for the group. So we see both this very strong group empathy as well as this increased preference for hierarchy. And a nice correlation or association with empathy response to group members as well as hierarchy preference. Now, if we look at what brain regions that are associated with this culture empathy relation, we see that, in fact, the left temporal parietal junction, a specific social brain region, is, in fact, associated with this culture and behavioral response. Now, the left temporal parietal junction has been very important in theory of mind, and in particular with social rules. So understanding the ways in which people navigate social relations is a function of their knowledge of norms. And we see here that when people are in interactions with group members, that in fact this heightened empathy for the group member in Koreans is in fact associated with this very strong increase in an activity for pain for the other within the temporal parietal junction. And furthermore, we see that the hierarchy preference of Koreans is predictive of activity within this region.
Excuse me, Joan. Hi, Bill Elwood. Thank you so much for coming. We only have 15 more minutes, and we have questions coming in by email, and I'm sure in the room. So I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I do hope that you'll leave time for questions.
Okay, great. Thank you. So we see this pattern of activity within the left temporal parietal junction as well as the right temporal parietal junction. So within the right temporal parietal junction, we also see this association with this brain region and empathy bias as well as this brain region and hierarchy response. So this suggests that both within the left and the right TPJ, that in fact we have this culture-empathy relation. So this suggests that social dominant orientation, or this culture of hierarchy, is in fact the only predictor of this group bias, empathy bias, and it's mediated as a function of neural activity within the left and right TPJ. So in fact, cultural variation in hierarchy preference will predict empathy bias as a function of cultural variation in the social brain. Now, how can we explain that the ways in which the social brain has dual mechanisms or multiple mechanisms for predicting the same kinds of social behavior? So, we can see that, in fact, there may be at least two kinds of social behavior. There's a simulative social behavior as well as a conceptual social behavior. So, for egalitarian cultures, the ability to respond from a self-other perspective, understanding through imagination or through simulation, and that in fact leads to an increased empathy response. In hierarchy-based cultures where there's this conceptual processing and normative understanding of social rules, that in fact this region plays a larger role in empathy. So the discoveries of cultural variability in the social brain suggest to us that when we look to explain population disparities within the nation as well as across the globe, that it's possible to identify root causes or root mechanisms of global mental health. So for instance, in this article, a landmark article, Grand Challenges in Global Mental Health, there are a number of different key priorities in closing the gap in population health disparities and identification of the root causes and mechanisms underlying this prevalence of mental health or health prevalence. More generally, it plays a very important role in closing that gap. So cultural neuroscience as a model and a framework can help to close this gap in population health disparities. When we look at it from a translational perspective or from a delivery perspective, so how is it that we can deliver disease prevention, disease reduction? One of the ways in which disease prevention occurs is in the clinical setting. So how is it that we can address sociocultural factors that affect these kinds of population variabilities or global mental health delivery? Looking at both the roles of same-race, cross-race interactions, the cultural context, as well as ethnicity. So looking at these different factors and how they can play an important role in disease prevention can illuminate, in fact, the ways in which this population health disparities can be addressed. Similarly, if we look from a health promotion perspective, how can we promote healthy behavior cross-nationally, globally? We can look at both as a function of economy. So, for instance, if we look at nations across different economic spectrum, how is it this geographic variability in wealth is influencing the investment in population health disparities reduction? And you can see that health promotion, knowing the cultural cures to mental health disorders, can in fact play a very important role in ensuring that this financial investment in human health cross-nationally can in fact reduce disease around the world. Now, from a basic science perspective, there's still a lot in terms of identifying particular root causes or mechanisms, but the Western scientific model has come a long way in 20 to 30 years to identifying those mechanisms across multiple levels of analysis. And comparisons of populations within clinical or non-clinical settings is an important future direction. The consortium, in particular, consortium approach, the International Cultural Neuroscience Consortium, is a group of interdisciplinary scholars dedicated to this promotion of theoretical and methodological approaches. And interdisciplinary approaches more generally to this question of mechanisms across nationally has been very helpful and informative. In particular, we have put together a number of different publications to address what are the key priorities within this community, in particular both research and also the ways in which it can begin to integrate with population health disparities. So there's been a lot of interest for many people, lifetime interest, and a question is how to move forward both in this disease prevention and health promotion model. So in summary, I'd like to thank research collaborators, in particular Tetsuya Idaka Madhuri and Tokiko Harada, as well as Michelle Gelfand, and Todd Parrish, Yingyi Hong, and Robert Livingston. members of the Northwestern Social, Affective, and Cultural Neuroscience Lab, ICNC, and you. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much. We have, for those of you who are interested in asking some questions, if I can ask you to come down to the microphone down here. This is being webcast, so it makes it easier for people who are watching live to hear you. So I invite any of you, those who have questions, to come on down. Oh, Isabel may be coming with questions online. Okay.
This is simple. How do we relate acculturation with cultural neuroscience? And that's from Stephen.
Could you repeat the question, please?
How do we relate acculturation with cultural neuroscience?
Absolutely. So looking at cultural change and the ways in which host and heritage cultures integrate, and how is it that host and heritage cultures affect the human brain? This is a key question within cultural neuroscience, and as in particular, the United States is a nation of immigrants. Cultural change is a key issue amongst Americans as well as across the globe. So when we think of the reasons why people will learn a new culture, looking at a first or a second culture, a native or a foreign culture, how is it that cultural change occurs, and then how is it that the human brain accommodates or adapts to that cultural change? This is a very important question. Ying-Yi Hong and C.Y. Chu have played a really important role in identifying, the different types of social factors that can affect adaptive acculturation. And in particular, they've identified cultural priming as a very important model theory, as well as a paradigm with which to measure cultural change. So if you simply just expose people to a native or a foreign language, a first or a second language, you can in fact look at the ways in which cultural change readily occurs. Similarly, you can see this in a visual paradigm, so looking at the different cultural products that exist within a given nation or a community, and the importance of those different types of cultural artifacts or cultural materials in cultural maintenance and cultural change.
Very interesting topic. So moving forward, I would like to hear your comment on how we're going to take into consideration of a social media, social network, given now the culture is really not physical. And so I wonder if you have any thoughts in terms of having study design within that, with that as a framework.
Right. So is this idea of culture as natural or cultural as physical or material, is that changing the way we think about human health? And, a number of researchers looking at embodied social cognition or embodied culture have begun to identify the ways in which physical activity or movement, for instance, human action, can influence the ways that people think socially. So, in fact, if we look at human action or the physical states of groups and individuals and how that can shape culture, as well as the brain, looking at cultural practices and the body as well, we see that there's a lot of very interesting work to be conducted.
I'm actually more thinking about how internet is actually shaping us.
Absolutely.
And people surround me, right?
Yeah. The internet and technology more generally is playing a very important and interesting role. So, in fact, a lot of the action in technology is less physical or is less environmental and is more psychological or mental. So, in fact, I think technology is leading to a lot of psychological action and maybe less physical action. So there may be, in fact, very interesting studies to be looking at technological use and the influence of technology as a cultural practice, both within the environment as well as within the individual.
So I want to thank you all for coming here today, and for those of you who are watching us online. And just to let you know, moving forward, we have these talks every month. So next month, we hope you would join us on February 11th for a lecture entitled, this is an interesting title, To Tweet or Not to Tweet, Community-Based Participatory Research Approaches to Advance Wellness and Violence Prevention via Social Media. So that sounds like a really interesting talk. So thank you all for coming here on Friday.